Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Best of American Heritage, Lincoln, by Edwin S. Grosvenor, read by David Drummond. Introduction. Lincoln's Legacy. Harold Holzer. During the campaign of 1860, and throughout what Henry Adams would justly call the great secession winter that fell like a shadow after that year's momentous presidential election, a convincing case could be made that Abraham Lincoln was totally unprepared to assume the nation's highest office, particularly at the hour of its gravest domestic crisis. At best a dark horse, Lincoln had won his party's nomination only when more seasoned stalwarts such as William H. Seward and Salmon P. Chase faltered at the raucous convention. Not only was Lincoln the least experienced candidate that year of any political origin, but as the Republican presidential candidate, he also represented the youngest and least tested political organization in the country. Though largely unknown outside his home state, Lincoln nonetheless refused to barnstorm on his own behalf during the 6 long months between his designation and Election Day. Insisting that he had said all he needed to say on doctrinal issues, and proclaiming only that he stood by the Republican Party platform affirming opposition to the spread of slavery by any means into new national territories, he remained calmly ensconced in Springfield as the opposition splintered. His few private letters show astounding poise and confidence, or was it the valor of ignorance, as he presciently estimated votes. Though his formidable foes included a thrice-elected member of the U.S. Senate, the nation's sitting vice president, and a former senator and cabinet secretary, Lincoln, merely a one-term ex-congressman who had failed in every election since his service in the House a decade earlier, handily prevailed. Even so, his victory, in which he amassed less than 40% of the popular vote, the smallest total ever to go to an outright winner, did little to reassure Northerners, particularly Democrats. And it did nothing to placate Southern fears that he would use his slim margin to destroy the slave power. The stock market plummeted, the timid demanded concessions, and several Deep South states proclaimed that they would secede from the Union. If ever an orderly transfer of power to a new president seemed open to question, it was then. Adams had grounds to lament the nation's failure to select a more seasoned statesman to face such troubling times. As we know now, young Adams, and nearly everyone else in the nation, wholly underestimated Abraham Lincoln. During the 4-month interregnum before his inauguration, he continued pursuing a remarkably confident, if politically counterintuitive, course of inaction. Anyone searching for clues to Lincoln's future greatness need only consult the dangerous few months that he navigated so skillfully. Under unprecedented pressure, but understanding that he lacked constitutional authority, he somehow managed to ensure that the government would be passed lawfully to his hands. The articles compiled here from the archives of American heritage convincingly remind us of his astounding growth. This quintessential civilian fortuitously morphed into one of the savviest commanders-in-chief in history. The lifelong landlubber developed a brilliant appreciation of naval warfare. The one-time Senate candidate who had pledged himself to white supremacy forever came to regard the African-American leader Frederick Douglass with enormous respect and colorblind collegiality, and the once pugnacious, highly partisan stump speaker matured into an impassioned and literate exponent of democratic ideals. Once elected, the former political provocateur evolved into nothing less than an apostle for the sanctity of union, the ethic of majority rule, and the dreams of freedom and equality of opportunity. Who could have so predicted when Lincoln had seemed the least qualified candidate for the presidency? In 1861, George Washington's birthday, at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Lincoln articulated the determination that would mark his presidency and characterize his place in history. "I would rather be assassinated on this spot than surrender it." The contributors to this collection of essays make clear, to quote Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, how and why he ultimately gave his life that that nation might live. 1. Campaigning with Guns and Words. Frederick D. Schwartz. On April 5, 1832, Black Hawk, a chief of the Sauk tribe, crossed the Mississippi River and set out for Rock Island in northwestern Illinois, accompanied by several hundred warriors and their families. Back in 1804, leaders of the Sauk and Fox tribes had agreed to abandon their lands east of the river, but Black Hawk and others denied the validity of that treaty. Now, he and his followers hoped to reclaim their ancestral village. Illinois Governor John Reynolds called for volunteers to repel the invasion, and on April 19th, word reached New Salem, the central Illinois home of Abraham Lincoln. 2 days later, about 6 local men formed a company and elected the 23-year-old Lincoln as their captain. Tall and athletic, Lincoln had arrived in New Salem the year before and quickly made friends and a reputation as a gifted storyteller. He was well read, having always preferred books to the routine chores of frontier life. His favorite tales, as a boy, were from Aesop's Fables and Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. He had also read and reread the King James Bible and biographies of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. His own story so far was unremarkable. He was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on a Kentucky farm. His father's failed farming ventures and disputes over land had spurred several moves, eventually landing the family in Indiana in 1816. His mother had died of milk sickness when he was 9, and his father had remarried. At age 22, Lincoln had struck out on his own. In New Salem, a merchant hired him to take goods by flatboat down the Sangamon River to New Orleans, where Lincoln first got a glimpse of slavery. In 1832, he and a partner had bought a small New Salem general store on credit. The business struggled, and Lincoln eventually sold his share. The future president had a grudge against the Native Americans. His father, Thomas, had told him stories of the Indian raid in 1786, in which his grandfather and namesake, Captain Abraham Lincoln, had been slain. Thomas, 6 at the time, had witnessed the attack, and afterward had been forced to support his family by working odd jobs in Kentucky and Tennessee. Lincoln was eager now to join the fight. On April 20th, Lincoln and his militiamen traveled to Beardstown on the Illinois River, where troops had been told to assemble. In a wrestling match with a member of another company held to determine which unit would occupy the better campground, Lincoln was beaten in 2 straight falls. Lincoln ran his charges through some perfunctory drills, but spent most of his time on administrative details, preparing a roll of the company's members and drawing and distributing supplies. On April 29th, some 1,500 volunteers began moving north, and at dusk on May 7th, they made camp near the scene of Black Hawk's invasion. Things were fairly peaceful along the Rock River, as regular Federal troops had already arrived in the area, causing the invaders to halt their advance. The newly arrived volunteers set out in search of Black Hawk. They didn't find him, partly because their guides were Winnebagos, who sympathized with the Sauks. The game of hide-and-seek turned into a shooting war on the evening of May 14th, when unruly volunteers attacked and killed a pair of emissaries from Black Hawk who sought to discuss peace. In the ensuing battle, 12 whites were killed, and the rest fled. Lincoln and his men arrived the next day and found the mangled and scalped bodies, which they helped to bury. After 2 more weeks of marching around northern Illinois, Lincoln's company was mustered out. He re-enlisted for 20 days in a mounted company, and when that term expired, he joined a company of spies and scouts and spent another 20 days performing reconnaissance. On July 10th, Lincoln's military career came to an end. He had served a little less than 12 weeks without seeing combat. The troops he left behind decisively defeated Black Hawk's band, massacring many Indians and taking the chief himself prisoner. Fortunately, however, if he had no military future, he had already started another career in politics. In March, before beginning his short service in the Illinois militia, Lincoln had announced his candidacy for the state legislature. Now, he devoted all of his energy to that campaign. He was passionate about local issues, such as navigational improvements on the Sangamon River. 6'4", he towered over his rivals, and cast an intimidating shadow. Brawny and adept with an axe, he sometimes made a show of splitting logs. He demonstrated his strength in other ways. When a fight broke out during his first campaign speech, Lincoln grabbed the assailant by his neck and the seat of his trousers, he later recounted, and threw him out of the fight. In the August 6th election, he finished 8th in a field of 13. The top 4 were elected. In his home precinct of New Salem, Lincoln was favored by all but 23 of the 300 voters. But he was hurt by his lack of money and state connections. It would not be his last losing race, but Abe Lincoln had found his calling. Lincoln would later poke fun at his military record. His only combat, he said, was with the mosquitoes, but he had seen enough of the aftermath of war to make a lifetime impression. For many years he called his election as militia captain a success which gave me more pleasure than any I have had since. Lincoln was rewarded for his military service with a federal land grant of 40 acres in Iowa. During those 3 months in the spring and summer of 1832, he also made the kind of friends that were crucial for a budding politician. Meeting volunteers from different parts of the state was useful to him politically, for it extended his reputation, wrote Lincoln biographer David Herbert Donald. While he was in the Army, he came into contact with a number of rising young political leaders of the state, like Orville Hickman Browning, a cautious, conservative Quincy lawyer, who would become one of his most influential and critical friends. More important was his acquaintance with John Todd Stewart, a Springfield lawyer who served as major in the same battalion as Lincoln. In the early 1830s, Lincoln became an admirer of Henry Clay, the senator from Kentucky, who with Daniel Webster of Massachusetts had formed the Whig Party to oppose the big government policies of President Andrew Jackson. The Whigs followed a Jeffersonian model of democracy, which demanded compromise and balance in government, and made a priority of national unity and territorial expansion. Though the Whig Party would become defunct by 1856, Lincoln held to its philosophies. After his election to president in 1861, he professed to friends to be an old-line Whig, a disciple of Henry Clay. While serving as New Salem's postmaster and then county surveyor, Lincoln studied privately to become a lawyer. His second campaign for the state legislature in 1834 was successful, and he won re-election 3 times to the Illinois House of Representatives. After passing the bar exam in 1836, he moved to Springfield to practice law, first under John Todd Stewart, and later starting his own practice with partner William Herndon, his eventual biographer. In Springfield, Lincoln met Mary Todd, a favorite cousin of his friend and mentor, whom he married in November 1842. In the state legislature, Lincoln voted to approve construction of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, and to expand voting rights to white males who were not landowners. He also began to attract attention with his free soil stance, opposing both slavery and abolitionism. "The institution of slavery," he said in 1837, "is founded on both injustice and bad policy, but the promulgation of abolition doctrine tends rather to increase than abate its evils." 6 years later, elected to represent Illinois in the U.S. House, Lincoln chose a side. With abolitionist Ohio Representative Joshua R. Giddings, Lincoln co-authored a bill to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. But when the bill failed to gather support among the Whigs, Lincoln abandoned it. Lincoln's 2-year term in Congress was also marked by his opposition to the Mexican War, which followed in the wake of the 1845 annexation of Texas. President James K. Polk's war goal was to expand American territory to the Pacific coast, but Lincoln saw it as a grasp for military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood. The Mexican War also raised the slavery question. Lincoln supported a provision introduced by Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot in 1846 that would have banned slavery in any territory won from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso was struck from the Compromise of 1850, which temporarily diffused the debate by allowing the new territories to decide by popular sovereignty whether to allow slavery within their borders. Lincoln's opposition to the war had turned public opinion against him, and in any case, he had pledged to serve only one term in Congress. So in 1849, his term up, Lincoln returned to Springfield to resume his law practice. For the next 5 years, he defended clients ranging from railroad executives in disputes with shareholders to men on trial for murder. He was drawn back into politics in 1854 by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened those new territories to slavery. The provision that allowed white male citizens to declare Kansas and Nebraska slave states by popular sovereignty had been introduced by Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. This bill lit the fuse on a rivalry between Lincoln and Douglas that burned for the rest of their lives, but never more fiercely than in 1858, when Lincoln ran to unseat Douglas in the Senate. Important principles were involved in the arguments between Douglas and Lincoln, and the 7 debates that highlighted their campaign were arguably the most famous political debates in American history. But raw politics shaped the campaign in the summer and fall of 1858, as Lincoln and Douglas calculated, pandered, exploited each other's weaknesses, and grabbed for votes in an increasingly desperate battle for a seat in the Senate. Party grandees exercised their own potent influence, feeding questions to the two men, criticizing their performances, and coaching from the sidelines during the debates in cities across the state of Illinois between August and October. The debates, eminent Lincoln historian Allan C. Gelzo emphasizes in his book Lincoln and Douglas, The Debates That Defined America, were only part of an often dirty political campaign, not a series of Socratic dialogues. Far more Illinoisans heard Lincoln and Douglas on courthouse steps, from railroad platforms, from hastily hammered-together stands at country fairs, and from the flatbeds of wagons, than heard them in face-to-face debate, Gelzo wrote. It was an indirect election. U.S. Senate seats at the time were filled by the state legislature, so Lincoln and Douglas were promoting local legislative candidates. The state divided into 3 ideological belts: the solidly Democratic South, separated from the solidly Republican North by a fat central Whig belt of voters opposed to slavery but committed to white supremacy. In this contested middle ground, both candidates trimmed and waffled, clawing for advantage and votes. Lincoln entered the campaign on the defensive, a purely local figure with only lukewarm support from the state party, and the whiff of failure hanging over him. He was respected. He was liked, even admired, Gelzo wrote, but he had the reputation of being a loser, and it does not look well in politics to lay your money on a slow horse. Expectations were low. The celebrated Douglas, a little dynamo on the speaking platform, did not make the mistake of underestimating his opponent. He is the strong man of his party, full of wit, facts, dates, and the best stump speaker, with his droll ways and dry jokes, in the West, Douglas told a supporter. In his House Divided speech, delivered in Springfield on accepting the nomination, Lincoln had provided Douglas with an opening. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," Lincoln had said. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." Throughout the debates, Douglas attacked Lincoln as an abolitionist, determined to bring North and South into conflict and elevate blacks to a position of equality with whites. The United States had survived for many years as a house divided, he argued, and could continue to do so as long as agitators like Lincoln were kept out of office. Lincoln, for his part, leapt on Douglas's much-heralded concept of popular sovereignty, according to which each state and territory should be free to choose slavery or not, as it liked. In theory, it was pernicious, he argued, because it refused to recognize slavery as a moral wrong and perverted the Founding Fathers' doctrine that all men were created equal. In practice, it could lead to the extension of slavery throughout the territories and, over time, the entire United States. The U.S. Supreme Court's infamous 1857 decision, in the case of a slave, Dred Scott, suing for his freedom, suggested that the court would not allow any state laws restricting the rights of slave owners. The tone and sometimes the arguments changed depending on the audience. Lincoln, facing a Whig audience in Charleston in the fourth debate and stung by constant race-baiting from Douglas, appeased his frightened party handlers and listed, Gelso wrote, a disgraceful catalogue of all the civil rights he, fully as much as Douglas, believed blacks could be routinely deprived of. Douglas, for his part, exploited the race issue for all it was worth. Who won? Depending on which newspaper you read, the first debate in upstate Ottawa was either a triumph or a disaster for either side. Lincoln's defeat was so severe, the Douglasite newspapers reported, that the Republicans hung their heads in shame, and their man, after collapsing from nervous exhaustion, had to be carried from the platform. On the contrary, a Republican newspaper reported, Douglas, his face distorted with rage, showed himself a maniac in language and argument, and Lincoln, to use the expression of the crowd, chawed him up completely. In truth, the ups and downs of the debates, and the tendency of both men to become entangled in lawyerly arcana on matters long forgotten, often make it difficult to figure out which candidate was getting the upper hand. Lincoln lost the election, for reasons having nothing to do with the debates. The Republicans received the most votes, but the Democrats won the most seats in the legislature, and Douglas was reelected. But the debates were reported in newspapers across the country, and Lincoln gained the national stature that would put him in the White House within a few years. Merely holding his own against the nationally known Douglas counted as a victory. 2. The Speech That Made the Man. Harold Holzer. On the frigid and stormy evening of February 27, 1860, so the newspapers reported, Abraham Lincoln climbed onto the stage of the cavernous Great Hall of New York's newest college, Cooper Union, faced a room overflowing with people, and delivered the most important speech of his life. Or so the myths maintained. In truth, a quarter of the hall's 1,800 plush seats remained empty for the evening's vigorously advertised political lecture, but not because of the weather, which was clear and balmy. Some eyewitnesses, and most historians since, would stubbornly report that a blizzard raged that night. The profits were so small because the night was so stormy, insisted one organizer. But Lincoln supporters may have created that legend to explain away the empty seats. The more likely reason for the less-than-sold-out house was indifference and competition from other events and attractions. Certainly, the venue did not lack for appeal. Cooper Union, a $600,000 brick wonder on Manhattan's Astor Place, had opened only months earlier to rave reviews. The New York Times praised the college's auditorium as not equaled by any room of a similar nature in the city or the United States. Dozens of gas-fed crystal chandeliers illuminated its mirrored walls and red-leather swivel chairs. The sole complaint was that cast-iron pillars obstructed clear views of the stage. But was the orator of the evening worth seeing? The Republican politician from Illinois, veteran of the widely reported Senate campaign debates with Stephen A. Douglas 2 years earlier, was making his first speech in the big city. Could he withstand the scrutiny of the fastest-talking, best-dressed, and most demanding audience on the planet? Other politicians had declined invitations to speak in the lecture series Lincoln was now bravely concluding. His decision to accept, to painstakingly research a lawyerly brief defending federal authority to regulate slavery, then undertake an exhausting journey from Springfield to New York, proved the savviest move of his political life, and it arguably changed history. Most in the crowd applauded when he appeared on stage that night and took his seat shortly before 8 p.m. Others gasped at the ungainly giant. At first sight, there was nothing impressive or imposing about him, admitted one eyewitness. His clothes hung awkwardly on his gaunt and giant frame. His face was of a dark pallor without the slightest tinge of color. His seamed and rugged features bore the furrows of hardship and struggle. His deep-set eyes looked sad and anxious. The evening's master of ceremonies, erudite poet-editor William Cullen Bryant, worked hard to soothe the apprehension. "To secure your profoundest attention," he pleaded, "I have only, my friends, to pronounce the name of—" and here he lightly paused for full dramatic effect, "Abraham Lincoln of Illinois." With that, the speaker slowly unfolded himself from his chair, rose to his towering height, and shambled toward the lectern. To one alarmed onlooker, he appeared rather unsteady in his gait. Then, in that harsh, high-pitched trumpet tone with which he invariably launched his orations, he uttered his first public words in New York, in a discordant frontier twang that must have jolted every listener in the room. "Mr. Chairman." At least, that was what some onlookers remembered hearing that night. The following morning, newspaper reprints insisted that he began with a more expansive salutation. "Mr. President and fellow citizens of New York." On this point, as with so many other details of the event, much remains in dispute. Myth and memory have long obscured the Cooper Union address as thickly as the fog that had shrouded the city a few days before. All we know for sure is that for the next 2 hours Lincoln skewered Stephen Douglas, deftly allied the Republicans with the Founding Fathers, promised the South he meant no threat to slavery where it existed, and then insisted that slavery itself was unmistakably evil. For 2 hours he held the crowd in the palms of his massive hands, taunting slavery expansionists at one moment, invoking George Washington and Thomas Jefferson the next, and finally concluding in a soaring peroration that right makes might, to an avalanche of cheers and flying hats. This much is certain. Had Abraham Lincoln failed at his do-or-die debut in New York, he would never have won his party's presidential nomination 3 months later, not to mention election to the White House that November. Such was the impact of a triumph in the nation's media capital. Had he stumbled, none of the challenges that roiled his presidency would ever have tested his iron will. To paraphrase his own later words, he would likely have escaped history altogether. Moreover, had Lincoln failed in New York, few might recognize today the nation he went on to defend and rededicate. It can be argued that without Cooper Union, hence without Lincoln at the helm, the United States might be remembered today as a failed experiment that fractured into a balkanized North America. Instead, Abraham Lincoln did triumph in New York. He delivered a learned, witty, and exquisitely reasoned address that electrified his elite audience and, more important, reverberated in newspapers and pamphlets alike until it reached tens of thousands of Republican voters across the North. He had arrived at Cooper Union a politician with more defeats than victories, but he departed, politically reborn. To be sure, the event did not inspire from Lincoln an oration on a rhetorical par with his Gettysburg Address or second inaugural address. Perhaps this is why the 7,700-word speech remains frequently mentioned, yet seldom quoted. Nor did it actually persuade many local voters to join the Lincoln bandwagon. The truth is, Lincoln never won the hearts or ballots of overwhelmingly Democratic and intractably racist New York City. Yet the speech may have accomplished more than any other he ever gave. At the Cooper Union, Lincoln became more than a regional curiosity. He became a national leader. As a bonus, Lincoln's Cooper Union appearance also inspired the most important single visual record of his, or arguably any, American presidential campaign. The image-transfiguring Matthew Brady photograph made earlier that same day. Its subsequent reproduction and proliferation in prints, medallions, broadsides, and banners did as much to herald the new Abraham Lincoln as did reprints of the speech itself. Supposedly, when Lincoln, now president-elect, encountered the photographer in Washington the following year, he volunteered, "Brady and Cooper Union made me president." Honest Abe was not exaggerating. They undoubtedly did. 3. How We Got Lincoln. Peter Andrews. Every presidential election is exciting. Then the passing of time usually makes the outcome seem less than crucial. But more than a century and a half later, the election of 1860 is still vivid. In the months between the start of the 1860 presidential campaign and the attack on...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?